I'm going to take on the research aspect of things and explain to you the kind of thing I've been trying to do for a long time. For about 10 years now, so it's getting a long time. So the thing that is really interesting in those things, I think that interactive storytelling only becomes possible when the character are working with the player towards giving an interesting experience. The roleplay example that Ruth was talking about only works because the different players actually are not playing in for themselves, they're actually playing for others. They're playing for the overall experience, and that's something that is quite powerful, but something that's quite difficult to do. So I'll be trying to explain to you very briefly how I've been working on this. So I focus on the characters. Roland Barthes said that stories were universal, and they definitely are. They come in all different kind of form and shapes and length and all that kind of things. You can read novels, you can look at watching movies, you can look at oral storytelling and all kind of things. And you can also look at paintings and you can see stories, you can look at various things. So there is a lot of power there. We also got the issues now then that we're trying to interact with the stories. So if you think of the diversity of all the different media we've got to deal with, there is not one single way of interacting with interactive stories. So I was trying to look at something a bit more central, a bit more focused on the actual essence of storytelling to try to take that approach. If you look at stories in general, you got a lot of rules, you got a lot of guidelines. What Ruth was explaining before is the hero's journey, for instance. It's very well documented, and that could be a very good starting point. So you can actually already plan what's going to happen to your character and plan those things around that kind of structure. The issue with interactive storytelling is really we're just starting. Okay, we've been talking about interactive storytelling for 20 years in AI maybe, and there's a lot of work to do. But there's not a lot of guidance on how to do those things and how to structure them yet. There's a lot of practice. People have been doing various things, but it's not quite clear yet. So the question is: are we looking for a needle in the haystack? Kind of, except that lots and lots of many different haystacks, many different ways of interacting with stories. And the question is not so much in finding the silver bullet answer to everything, because I don't think it exists. The answer that for us is to try to actually find which element, about storytelling, about narration, about enjoying the story, about reading a story or getting into a story, that are actually key and can be interacted with. So that's sort of like where I'm starting from. So I was thinking, okay, a lot of rules about stories. We can talk about the characters, we can talk about the narration, we can talk about the discourse, all those kind of things, but what can we interact with in those things? So I focus on the character, and I'm going to give you a tale of my, I think, successes and failures at the moment. And if you think about the character in stories, there is an interesting approach there, is there is a lot of convenience when you tell a story. So if you think about the Cheshire Cat, for instance, it's a great character. It really appears out of nowhere when the story is not going very far, and then push the story forward, right? So by giving some information, by starting something, and put that story forward. And once the story is moving forward, the Cheshire Cat has appeared. Very convenient. So what he's doing there is playing a support role, really. He's playing the support role to move the story of Alice forward. And that's something that's quite interesting. So more cats. That's what I call the stroker cat syndrome. Back to what Ruth was explaining before with Robin Hood, it's the same thing with James Bond, right? It's always the kind of thing is, right, I've got you now, James Bond. I've been wanting to kill you for about 20 years, now I've got you. Right, before I do so, I'm going to stroke my cat and I'm going to tell you everything about what I'm going to do for world domination. That's the way it's going to work. You want to know before you die. So that's not logical, right? And as Ruth pointed out before, if I've waiting to kill James Bond for 20 years, the first opportunity I get, I'll probably take it. I will not go and explain all those things. But it's there for a reason, and the reason why it's there is for the audience, right? It's there for people who are listening to the stories, watching the stories. It's got a role in terms of building momentum, in terms of building the stories, in terms of explaining different plot lines, explaining different things. So it's very important in that case. But when you think about interactive storytelling, then you are the person, you are the user, you are the central character into this. How is that going to play with you? How is the system actually going to know about what you've been trying to do for a long time, and how you're going to move forward from those things? So this is not very clear, because it's actually very complex, because what we're doing is changing the perspective. So we're not going from the perspective of characters displaying a story for an audience. You're actually moving to characters interacting for an audience member as part of the character cast. It's a very different proposition. So what I've been trying to do is to look at what we call metafiction and why it's important. So metafiction, in simple word, it's the idea that the character in the story is not only aware that he is a character in the story, but is also aware that it's playing a role for the whole story, right? So what I'm trying to do there is basically trying to get a character that knows that he is a character or she is a character, and the role is to actually give a good story to the player or to the user, the member of the audience. And it's quite difficult to do. So if you think about how a character should think, you take a character and you give that character a mind, and that's what we've been doing. We've been building artificial minds for synthetic actors, and without going into a lot of details, basically there is a range of emotions that are modeled virtually, and those emotions are actually driving the character to assess a situation, meet some goals, and take some decisions. So the character has goals, he looked at the situation, thinks about it, emotionally think about those things, respond to those things. And does that equal to drama? That is the question. Not quite. Okay. What we've got there basically is Spock, right? We've got the character that's got its goals. Hey, James Bond is here. Let's kill it now, right? Because that's what it will be the most logical thing to do. So that doesn't push drama forward. So the next step that we've been doing is you put the character, you put the character in mind, and it's going to assess the situation. But instead of assessing the situation just on his goals and his actions, it's going to try to take into consideration the impact of those actions or those goals on the other characters in the story. So the idea there that we can create something more dramatic, because rather than taking the choice between two actions that seemingly do not have any impact on anyone, actually if we can project and find out whether all the characters will be impacted by this, we can take the decision that's going to be the most dramatic. So we're basically focusing everything on emotion, right? Response, is it drama? Yes and no. So that's probably one of my failures. I created a small system and I created some stories about this, and it turned everything into Chuck Norris, basically. It was just chaos. From the moment you put characters together, it erupted. So I had a problem with space, right? No pace in my story, no structure. It was just, I'm going to make you suffer kind of thing. That didn't quite work out. So I decided to go for a more distributed approach to this, and this is what we've got at the moment. So we got the player, and we want to take the player on that emotional journey, right? Which is what all stories are doing. And that's our emotional journey. So you can see you've got different stories, different valleys and mountains and everything. And what we want to do is to take the player onto one of those things, or several. So in order to do this, what we do now is that we got characters in the story that are actually linked to one another. So all those characters are talking with each other. Well, actually, they don't quite talk. They can access each other's brain, which is even better, right? But so we got that kind of, so each character can read another character's brain, and what they can do after that is to actually get a virtual representation of what the player's emotions or status would be based on the player's previous interaction. So we sort of like get a fake model of what the user character might be, and we then take those actions that we could take, simulate and see how they affect the player, or they could affect the player, and use that to make our decisions based on emotional target. So we've got an emotional mapping of this user experience, and we're trying to achieve this. All the characters are trying to achieve, take the players along that emotional trajectory as they go along. Okay, it's all very superficial because obviously we don't access the player's brain, but it's a way of trying to represent it. So what we're trying to do now, and that's where we are at the moment, is we're looking at pace in terms of how fast we want the story to progress, and we're also looking at emotional trajectory in order to try to get an experience that reflects what we actually would like to do from a structural perspective. So that's my attempt to try to do structure and pace in the emergent context that Ruth was defining.